Hello artists, and welcome to part 1 of creating your acrylic technique anchor chart. For supplies, I have a cup of water and paper towel for wiping my brushes on. I have 3 colors of paint. We're going to focus with just the primary color today because I really want you to focus on the techniques and not as much with mixing and value. We will do that a little bit more in a different video. But I have my cadmium yellow, cobalt blue, and cadmium red. And I've got a whole variety of brush sizes, including a palette knife, which you may not have used before, but we'll talk about how to use that a little bit in this video. All right, so with our techniques, the first one I want to do is a wash. Now, we learned how to do a wash when we did our watercolor painting, and I remember from creating the washes that I want to use a big brush because it covers a big space at one time. So I'm gonna dip this in my water, and I'm gonna go with a light color for my wash in the background because it's always easy to go darker. Now, unlike watercolors, I can paint over things, but it's still probably better for a wash to stick with our lightest color first. So I dip my brush into my paint here, get some water on it, and I'm using this big brush so I can cover a big space at one time. I don't want to do a small brush here because it would end up really streaky, and I want to create a big space that's all covered up nice and even. All right, so there you go, there's our wash, and we're going to come back to that one in a little bit, back to that square with some more stuff on it. Now, the next technique I want to show you is called dry brushing, and we also learned about dry brushing in watercolor. So I'm going to take a round brush here, and I'm going to combine this one with scumbling. Scumbling we talked about back in colored pencil. It's when you work in a circular motion. So I'm going to use this dry brush that hasn't been in the water with some paint that doesn't have any water in it, and I am going to work in a circular motion. So I'm going to get just a little bit of paint on this brush, and I am going to work in a circular motion. Now, so see here what I get with the round brush. It can be a little difficult to control what I'm doing. So experiment with different size and shape brushes for doing this. I'm going to try a smaller flat brush now. I'm gonna get a little bit different results here with my scumbling. Just working in this circular motion, making sure we don't have any water here. So there you go, that is combined scumbling and dry brush. There's a lot of cool things you can do with texture for dry brushing. It doesn't have to be in that scumbling pattern. Try out some different things with different brushes. Okay, so the next one I want to show you is using the palette knife. Now, probably haven't used one of these palette knives before, but the difference here is that I can really scoop a lot of paint onto the surface at one time. So I'm gonna take my knife in my paint, and I can use it to paint here. And what you'll notice, it's a little bit difficult to use on the video, but when you try it, you'll see that it creates like a texture on the surface. Now, most of the paint we have at school is more liquid, but we do have some in some jars, and the kind in the jars would be great for this. Now, this technique is called impasto, and it just gets on there really thick. So that's why the ones in the jars would be great, because they are a lot more heavy bodied, those kinds of paints. And when you're doing your anchor chart, I want you to try seeing what different things you can do with this knife. If you change directions, and we have different shaped knives too, so you can experiment with different things. All right, and you'll want to wipe it off on your paper towel. Okay, So that one is called impasto. We have wash, dry brush and scumbling, impasto. All right, next up on our step 1 of anchor chart, we are going to take a brush and I actually want to create another wash. Let's go out to this big brush. This one, in this box, we're going to end up doing sgraffito. We might have to wait for this to dry before we come back to our sgraffito. Okay, I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and I'm going to go back to my first one. This is dry now, so what's really great about acrylics is they dry really fast. So I want to paint over this, but I don't want it to be very dark. So this technique is called a glaze. So in a glaze, I am going to take some really watered down paint and work on top of this. Now, I want what I'm doing to be light, so I'm not gonna have a ton of paint in it. We're gonna a lot of water mixed into our paint. So there we got a glaze going on. All right. Over in this box, I'm going to show you some stippling. Now, we've been talking about stippling since we were working with pencils. So I know that stippling is creating little dots with the paintbrush, with the paint. So I'm gonna take my blue here, and here we got some stippling. We're not going to focus too much on value yet, but I know that I can combine colors together, so different stippling colors next to each other to get different values going. Now I find that a round brush works best for stippling, but try out different brushes, different shapes, also different sizes of the round brushes will give you different results. You can also try pressing a little bit harder with your paintbrush so you get different size dots. Experiment. Your anchor chart is all about experimenting and being able to come back to this resource so when you're creating your paintings, you can see what works best for your project. Okay, so over here, this one's not quite dry yet, so ideally I'd like to wait a little bit longer, but I'm gonna go ahead and paint over this again. You'll see how this sgraffito works. So I'm gonna take a thicker layer of paint on top here. Okay, and then I am going to take the opposite end of my paintbrush to draw into the wet paint. So I have to make sure to do it while this layer of paint is still wet, and I know that it needs to be thick paint, but now I can see what was below it. I can also use that palette knife to create some different types of lines and texture. All right, so that is part 1 of our anchor chart that has a wash with some glaze, scumbling and dry brush, impasto, sgraffito, and stippling. See you again later for part 2 of our anchor chart.